Hey, everybody, and welcome back to Sip&Talk.
So, Harvard University, it seems like they just can't stay out of the headlines lately.
Yeah, definitely been a lot of buzz around them.
And today, our deep dive is jumping right into one specific moment that really seemed to, ignite a firestorm of conversation. We're talking about a commencement speech.
That's right. A speech given by a Chinese graduate student.
Exactly. And we've really been digging into this.
Yeah, we have. We've sifted through, quite a stack of sources, articles, research papers, lots of commentary from, different perspectives.
Wow.
All looking at Harvard's, let's say, complex relationship with China and the reaction, the really intense reaction to this specific speech.
So our mission for you today really is to try and cut through some of that noise. We want to unpack what was actually said in the speech itself, figure out why it seemed to provoke such strong negative reactions from some corners, and understand the whole backdrop of Harvard's ties to China that kind of surrounds this whole thing.
And what it all means, really.
Yeah, what does it all mean? Especially thinking about the ideas she presented and where those ideas might actually land effectively or maybe where they don't.
It's your quick way to get up to speed on this, basically.
A shortcut to being informed, exactly, with maybe some surprising bits along the way.
And look, to really grasp the reaction to this speech, you kind of have to see the stage it was delivered on, right?
Yeah.
Harvard's relationship with China, it's become really quite controversial recently.
How controversial are we talking?
Well, some sources are using pretty sharp language. I mean, mockingly calling it the CCP party school.
Wow. Okay, CCP party school. That's a nickname that definitely grabs your attention. What's fueling that kind of criticism based on the sources?
It seems to be a few key things, all kind of interconnected. A really big one is Harvard accepting huge donations from China.
Money.
Hundreds of millions, according to reports. And some sources suggest these funds are coming from entities that are, linked pretty directly to the Chinese government.
So follow the money, as they say.
Exactly. And it's not just the money. Critics also point to collaboration projects.
Like what kind of projects?
The Harvard Kennedy School, specifically, has run programs training Chinese officials for years.
Oh, okay.
And that activity is cited as a key reason for that second Central Party school nickname some people use.
Right. Training officials from a, authoritarian state. That definitely adds a layer of complexity, doesn't it?
It absolutely does. And then there was this specific incident in 2024 that got a lot of attention and added fuel to the fire.
What happened?
So the Chinese ambassador to the U.S., Xi Feng, was giving a speech at Harvard. And during the speech, some Taiwanese and Tibetan students started protesting.
Okay.
What happened next, according to the sources, was that a Taiwanese student was physically dragged away by a Chinese graduate student.
Physically dragged away. Wow. That sounds really charged. How did Harvard handle that situation?
Well, this is where the sources critical of Harvard's approach really dig in. Reportedly, Harvard put the protesting students on probation for disrupting the event.
Okay. Consequences for protesting. Makes sense, maybe.
But they did not punish the Chinese student who actually did the physical removal.
Wait, really?
Yeah. And some reports even say the university expressed, understanding for his actions.
Hold on. So protest the ambassador, you get probation. Physically remove a protester. Maybe not. I mean, you can see how that kind of handling would reinforce that CCP party school narrative for critics.
It definitely became a key data point in that narrative for those watching. And look, this context, it's bigger than just one incident. There's been direct pressure from the U.S. government, too.
Pressure on Harvard.
Yeah. Sources mention a potential threat from the Department of Homeland Security, this was in 2025 apparently, to actually revoke Harvard's ability to enroll international students.
Revoke their ability? That's huge for a university like Harvard. Why would they threaten something so drastic?
Well, the allegations, according to these sources, included claims that the school, quote, coordinated with the Chinese Communist Party, and that these ties were creating an unsafe campus environment, among other things.
Coordinated with the CCP, unsafe campus, serious charges.
Very serious. And there have also been investigations highlighting collaborations with Chinese institutions that are linked to their military. Think Tsinghua, Zhejiang, Hwasong University of Science and Technology.
Military-linked institutions.
And get this, some sources note that some of these research projects were, surprisingly, even partially funded by the U.S. Department of Defense, which obviously raises huge national security concerns.
So wait, research ties potentially linked to the Chinese military, but funded partly by the Pentagon. That sounds like a complete minefield.
It's incredibly complex, yeah. And a House committee investigation reportedly went even further, specifically accusing Harvard of training members of the Xinjiang Production and Construction Corps.
XPCC. But aren't they sanctioned by the U.S.?
Exactly. Sanctioned by the U.S. government for their role in the Uyghur genocide. And then you add this historical backdrop of, children of high-ranking Chinese officials attending Harvard over the years.
Okay, wow. So you've got this whole really intricate web then. Massive donations, programs, training officials, security concerns about research, that controversial protest handling, historical ties to the elite.
That's the picture.
Yeah.
And all these issues, they become intensely politically charged, right? Largely because of the rising U.S.-China geopolitical tensions. This whole climate of scrutiny on Chinese influence in U.S. academia, that's the backdrop for this commencement speech we're talking about.
Which brings us right to the speech itself. The one that stirred up so much of this debate. It was given by Zhang Yurong. She also uses the name Luana Jiang.
Right.
A Chinese graduate student, and notably the first Chinese female graduate speaker at Harvard's commencement. This was the 374th ceremony, May 29th, 2025. She got her Master of Public Administration in International Development from the Kennedy School.
And the speech was titled, Our Humanity.
Our Humanity. Okay. So, based on the sources, what were the main ideas she was trying to get across? What was the message?
Well, the core theme seemed to revolve around global solidarity, our common humanity, and really the importance of understanding people from different backgrounds.
Yeah.
Especially now in a world that feels, pretty fragmented.
Seems like a positive message on the surface. Were there specific moments or quotes that really stood out or maybe got highlighted later?
Yeah, there were.
Yeah.
She told this little anecdote, apparently, about trying to figure out a washing machine in Mongolia with classmates from India and Thailand.
Okay.
Using it as like a simple example of cross-cultural cooperation, And she had this line that got quoted a lot. We started to believe that those who think differently, vote differently, or believe differently are not just wrong, we mistakenly see them as evil, but it doesn't have to be this way.
Challenging polarization.
Exactly. And she concluded with the thought, human flourishing is mutual. But maybe the phrase that drew the most significant attention and scrutiny later was this one. Those who we label as enemies, they too are human. In seeing their humanity, we find our own.
Those who we label as enemies, they too are human. Wow. That's a pretty powerful call for empathy, isn't it?
It absolutely is. And it's probably worth remembering her background here, too. She's a Chinese national, yes, but she has significant international education high school in the UK, undergrad at Duke, then Harvard.
Right. And just to underscore the timing, again, this speech with this message happened exactly when Harvard was under all this intense scrutiny from the U.S. government about its China connections that we just laid out.
That sensitive timing is absolutely crucial context for understanding the reaction that came next. So, okay, here you have this speech, Our Humanity, right? Filled with what seemed like pretty universal themes, empathy, understanding, common ground. Why then did it spark such strong negative reactions from some critics? I mean, being labeled hypocritical and even disgusting.
Yeah, that does feel like a huge disconnect, doesn't it? The message sounds so positive, almost unobjectionable, but the reaction reported is just deeply negative. What's going on there?
That's really the crux of the whole controversy. And the reactions, they were varied. It got a lot of attention in China. Some reactions were emotional. Others were critical of her elite status.
Okay.
In the U.S., it definitely triggered questions about potential CCP links, and some conservative commentators criticized it as sort of indirect support for the Chinese government. But the deepest reasons for that really negative backlash, according to the sources we looked at, they go right back to that disconnect you just mentioned.
Okay, let's try and break down that disconnect then. What's the first major issue critics raised?
Well, probably the most significant point of contention is the perceived contradiction between her identity and the message she delivered.
Her identity. Meaning her background.
Exactly. Critics really jumped on her background, suggesting she likely benefited quite a bit from the CCP system. Sources mention details like her father maybe being a high-level executive at a state-owned enterprise, or possibly a director of a CCP-funded NGO.
Ah, okay. High-level connections, potentially.
Potentially. And also that she was reportedly recommended by a member of the CPPCC, that's the Chinese People's Political Consultative Conference, a key advisory body seen as very closely tied to the party.
So the critics are essentially saying, look, you come from a background that seems potentially deeply embedded in the system.
Right, and now you're standing on this major stage in the free world, giving a speech about inclusion, equality, and, not demonizing opponents. But the critics argue she was completely silent on the documented realities of the Chinese government's own repression.
Like what, specifically?
Well, the suppression of free speech, religious persecution, what's happened in Hong Kong, Xinjiang, the stance towards Taiwan. Critics say she didn't touch any of that.
Ah, okay. So it's the perceived silence on those really tough, specific realities while speaking very broadly about tolerance and understanding. That's the issue.
That's a huge part of it. Critics see this as a kind of value double standard. They feel it comes across as a moral whitewashing of the CCP's actions, like using the platform of free speech in the West to deliver a message that feels completely at odds with the realities of an unfree system without even acknowledging the tension exists.
Right. It sounds like that contrast between the messenger's perceived background and context, especially the things left unsaid, versus the message itself is a key pain point for these critics.
It's absolutely central. And then there's another major criticism which points to the similarity of her language to official Chinese rhetoric.
The similar how?
Well, sources are clear she did not use the exact phrase, community with a shared future for mankind. It was Xi Jinping's big diplomatic concept.
Right, I've heard that term.
But critics argue that her phrasing and her themes, emphasizing things like shared humanity, shared future, mutual flourishing, they strongly echo the core ideas and, importantly, the style of language used in that concept.
So maybe not quoting it directly, but sounding very, very similar to official CCP diplomatic language. Is that the argument?
That's exactly the critics' argument. They feel the style is just too close to CCP diplomatic rhetoric. These very high-level, kind of abstract moral narratives that, in their view, feel more like trying to project official values onto the world stage, rather than, say, a genuine personal reflection grounded in lived experience, especially experience related to repression or disagreement. Some describe it as feeling empty or not grounded.
Huh. An abstract, sort of high-level moral message coming from someone perceived as potentially linked to an authoritarian system and delivered in language that echoes that system's own official phrasing.
Okay, I can see how that would raise eyebrows.
Mm-hmm. And then you layer on the timing and the global realities of when she gave this speech. Right, we mentioned the scrutiny on Harvard, but what about wider world events?
Well, this speech about unity and mutual understanding, it was delivered during a time of really significant global conflicts and tensions. Think about Ukraine, Gaza, the heightened tensions in the Taiwan Strait, the ongoing repression in Hong Kong and Tibet.
Yeah, a lot of heavy, serious global issues happening right then.
Exactly. And so in that context, critics felt that hearing an elite student from a very powerful state speak so abstractly about unity and mutual understanding, it just seemed like avoiding the important issues, or maybe even an attempt to sort of clean up China's image internationally amidst all these real-world conflicts and human rights concerns.
Like, it sounds a bit tone-deaf, speaking these nice words about peace and unity while the world is practically on fire with divisions and actual conflict.
That's how some perceived it, yes. And tied right into that is the criticism about moralizing without addressing her own context. Critics found it really difficult to accept a message about not demonizing those who think differently from someone who is perceived as potentially benefiting from a system that, well, actively imprisons dissidents, heavily censors dissenting views online, and is seen by many as fundamentally intolerant of difference.
So the perception becomes almost like getting a lecture on tolerance from someone whose context seems linked to intolerance. Is that fair?
That's how some sources frame it, yes.
Yeah.
They see it almost as the oppressor teaching the victim tolerance, which they view as a real distortion of values. And then finally, there's this underlying perception of manipulation.
Manipulation? How so?
Some critics interpret her using this really visible platform at Harvard, delivering what seems like a politically safe, but perhaps CCP-aligned narrative. They see it as a form of soft power manipulation, the idea being that the CCP might use the privilege of free speech available in the West to project a more favorable image and kind of obscure the harsher realities of its own unfree regime.
Okay, that's a really comprehensive breakdown of the criticism. So if I'm kind of putting it all together, the intense negative reaction isn't necessarily critics saying the words shared humanity or understanding are inherently bad.
Not usually.
Instead, it's this whole package deal, right? It's the perceived contradiction between the speaker's identity, her background, her silences, combined with the stylistic echoes of official rhetoric, the timing during global crises, and all layered onto the already fraught context of Harvard's own relationship with China. All of that seems to collide around this one speech.
Exactly. It's that perceived disconnect, that gap, that really generates the heat and the controversy. As some sources bluntly put it, to critics, it just felt like a privileged person's hypocritical humanism.
And adding another layer here, maybe making things even more complex and fueling that criticism for some, there's a specific incident brought up in one of the sources we looked at, and this actually loops back to that 2024 protest incident we mentioned earlier.
Right, the one during the Chinese ambassador Xi Feng's speech at Harvard, where the Taiwanese and Tibetan students protested, and that Taiwanese student got physically removed by another Chinese student.
Exactly. Well, one particular YouTube source makes a pretty specific and, frankly, quite public claim about that incident. This source alleges that Zhan Yurong herself, the commencement speaker, wasn't just present at that protest, but was actively involved in trying to stop those protesters.
Wow, okay. That's a really serious claim. That directly connects her alleged actions to the whole controversy around her words later. What kind of evidence does that source present to try and back that claim up?
Well, the source lays out several pieces of what they present as evidence. First, they claim there's a photo posted on Jiang's own LinkedIn account, apparently taken the same day as the protest video. They argue this photo shows a scarf, a hairstyle, and facial features that closely match someone seen near the incident in the video footage from the protest.
Okay, so visual comparison is part of it. What else?
The video footage itself, according to this source, shows a person fitting her description walking near the incident right as the first protester is being dragged out. And then, and this is maybe the most pointed part of their claim, the source alleges that this same person, matching her description, is later seen in the video returning hurriedly, almost as if going to get assistance to stop the second protester, the Tibetan student. And then, immediately after she returns, the Chinese student who did the dragging in the earlier part of the video follows her.
I see. So the argument from this specific source is pretty direct then. Here's someone who later gives this major commencement speech talking about shared humanity, listening deeply, how enemies are human too.
Right, all those themes.
But allegedly, her actual actions during this earlier protest incident were the complete opposite. Supposedly, she was assisting in shutting down dissent and helping remove protesters.
Precisely. The source explicitly uses this alleged involvement during the protest to draw a really stark contrast with her words later in the commencement speech. You know, sit with discomfort, listen deeply, stay soft in hard times. Enemies are human too. Shared humanity. They present this alleged gap between action and word as, quote, hypocrisy at its finest.
Okay.
So for those who find that particular source's evidence convincing, it becomes this really powerful, specific example illustrating those perceived contradictions that were fueling the broader controversy around her speech.
Okay, let's maybe pivot slightly now and look at the message itself again, but from a different angle, one that was raised in some of the sources. We have this speech using language about unity, understanding differences, shared humanity. It leads to a really fascinating question. Could that message, delivered as it was, could it effectively apply or even be directed towards China itself, specifically towards the CCP government?
That's a deep question. I mean, on the face of it, wouldn't a message of understanding and shared humanity be something you'd want to apply globally, including to governments? Why wouldn't it apply?
Well, you'd absolutely hope so, wouldn't you? In theory. The message's core ideas, promote understanding, avoid demonizing others, emphasize our shared fate. They sound like universal goods. However, the sources we looked at suggest this message becomes incredibly difficult, maybe even outright not applicable, when the target is the CCP government itself.
Why the disconnect there? What makes it so hard to apply that kind of message to the government specifically?
Well, the primary reason cited is the fundamental conflict with the CCP's governance model. I mean, the CCP operates under a one-party system, right? It relies heavily on strict censorship and actively suppresses any form of organized dissent or opposition.
Right. Control is key.
Exactly. So a message promoting respecting different ideas or listening deeply to opponents, it directly clashes with that system's need for absolute control. The CCP leadership might not see it as a constructive call for dialogue, but as a fundamental challenge to its authority, even its existence.
So it's like the very structure of the state makes the message itself seem threatening or incompatible.
That's the argument, yeah.
Yeah.
And then there's also the significant conflict with the CCP's human rights record.
Yeah.
As we've touched on, the CCP faces widespread, serious accusations of systemic human rights abuses, including the situation in Xinjiang, which the U.S. government and others have labeled a genocide. So a simple abstract call for unity, or shared humanity, without addressing those specifics, could easily be perceived by critics, especially by victims, as ignoring the stark reality of state-sponsored suffering. It risks failing to address the systemic nature of the oppression.
So the message, however well-intentioned, might feel like it just bypasses or smooths over those really harsh realities of state actions.
It runs that risk, certainly. Furthermore, there's the risk of misuse or co-option. Remember how we talked about the speech's language echoing official rhetoric?
Yeah.
Well, the CCP already uses terms like community with a shared future in its foreign policy. And critics argue that's largely a strategic tool to advance its own global influence and its own set of values.
Right.
So if you direct similar-sounding language at the CCP, there's a potential risk that the message gets co-opted, twisted, and basically used as propaganda to support the government's existing policies, rather than genuinely fostering understanding or encouraging any kind of change.
So the message could inadvertently become part of the system's own narrative rather than challenging it from the outside.
That's the danger highlighted, yes.
Yeah.
And finally, just on a practical level, there are real on-the-ground barriers. The CCP government has become increasingly wary of external ideas and influence, especially from the West.
You've tightened things up?
Considerably. They've tightened national security laws, they've restricted foreign NGOs, academic exchanges are more scrutinized. So publicly urging the CCP as a government to respect different views, it could easily be perceived as unwelcome interference in their internal affairs. And it's just incredibly difficult to implement or advocate for effectively within their highly controlled system.
Okay. So even if the core message of shared humanity is coming from a sincere place, the very nature of the authoritarian state, its structure, its actions, its control mechanisms, makes it profoundly difficult for that specific kind of universal message to land effectively, or maybe even safely, when it's directed at the government itself.
That's what the sources strongly suggest, yeah. I mean, look, there might be some space for using similar language very carefully in high-level diplomacy, maybe just to ease tensions a bit, or perhaps at the civilian-to-civilian level, for cultural exchange. But the significant challenges really remain when you try to apply these universal-sounding ideas directly to the authoritarian state.
Yeah.
And what's truly fascinating here, I think, is considering where and how these messages about seemingly universal values, like shared humanity, are actually effective, and how much that effectiveness is shaped by the specific political system and the context they run into.
Okay, let's try and bring all these different threads together now. What we've really deep dived into here is this incredibly complex situation. You've got Harvard, right? A major global university trying to navigate these significant financial ties and intense geopolitical pressures, especially relating to the U.S.-China relationship. Then you have this highly visible commencement speech delivered by a student with a Chinese background using these broad themes of unity and shared humanity.
Seems straightforward enough on paper.
But then comes this really layered, often intensely negative reaction. And as we've unpacked, that reaction seems fueled by this perceived gap, the gap between her identity and context, the timing of global events, the echoes of official language in her speech, and even specific past incidents like that protest.
Right. The core tension, as it emerges from digging into these sources, it isn't really just about the literal words spoken, is it?
No, it seems much deeper than that.
It really seems to stem from that perceived disconnect, that gap between the messenger's background, their context, especially when that background is linked, rightly or wrongly, to a system that critics see as fundamentally contradicting the very values being espoused in the message and the message itself.
So it really underscores that it's not just what you say, but maybe just as importantly, who is saying it, where they're perceived as coming from, and the specific context, the time, the place, the surrounding events they are speaking into. All of that profoundly shapes how a message is actually received and whether it's seen as credible or not.
Exactly. And for you, listening to this, understanding this deep dive, hopefully it helps illustrate how these big forces, global politics, the actions of major institutions like Harvard, individual voices on prominent stages, and then the rapid-fire reactions amplified by social media, how they all intersect in these incredibly complex, sometimes messy ways. It really shows the vital importance, I think, of looking beyond just the surface content of any message and trying to critically examine the source, their context, their potential biases or silences, and the specific, often challenging real-world situation in which those words are actually delivered. And maybe just to leave you with something to mull over, in a world that feels, let's face it, increasingly divided, grappling with these deep conflicts and systemic problems, when messages calling for shared humanity and understanding are put out there, is the message itself the most important thing? Does it hold some universal truth regardless of who says it? Or is it actually the perceived credibility, the background, the entire context of the messenger that ultimately determines how that message is heard, whether it's accepted, and how impactful it can truly be?
That definitely gives you a lot to think about.
Well, we really appreciate you joining us for this deep dive into what is clearly a very complex and sensitive situation.
Yeah, thanks for tuning in. And hey, before you go, we really encourage you to subscribe to the Sip and Talk podcast if you haven't already. And also check out our old friend Mickey's YouTube channel. It's got some fun memes, music, wine tasting, even travel vlogs. Seriously, remember to check it out.